Hi everyone, it's Syrian Girl. This is huge news. The US is going to withdraw from Syria. Everyone is ecstatic, and except of course for the neocons and neoliberals. Um, Basically, there's a lot of questions right now. Why is this happening now? Is it really going to happen? Should we be happy? Because what if we're about to be disappointed? And I think, Trump's made some statements now that are very, very difficult to go back from. He invoked the fact that soldiers have died in multiple wars, and they would be the most happy if they were alive today about the idea of the US no longer being in an illegal occupation of Syria. And there's no point for US troops to be there. I mean, first of all, it is illegal. It's against international law. Syrian people definitely don't want an occupation, and they don't want what the neocons are trying to do in Syria, which is to balkanize the country, slice out basically a piece of Syria the size of Croatia that contains 80% of Syria's oil, most of the water, most of the resources that 22 million people are supposed to be using. And the idea that the neolibs are pushing is that US troops have to be there because of the Kurds. We have to support the Kurds. We have to protect the Kurds. And it's ridiculous because the idea that they're pushing is that the US has to slice a piece of Syria and give it to Kurds. Why? I mean, what does the US have to gain from that? First of all, it means that Syria won't be able to rebuild, which means that refugees won't be able to return. And what kind of a humanitarian would want to give the oil wealth and the resources of 22 million people to only 1.5 million of its population? Based on what? So what's going to happen now is one of two things. Either the Kurdish militias come to their senses and work with the Syrian army to reunite Syria and hand over the land and the infrastructure, or they're going to cause a Turkish invasion, and in their lame attempt to fight the Kurds, they're going to end up running for the hills and granting Turkey control over a large part of Syria. So even though we should be very happy about the US withdrawal, and I'm talking about both Syrians and Americans, we should both be very happy about a US withdrawal and support it. This is not the end of the line, at least for Syria. Syria is still going to have to face Turkey, which is part of NATO. And, going back to how sudden this was, it's interesting that just like last week, US generals were telling the Washington Post that they're going to remain in Syria indefinitely. And the US was building these outposts, basically these lookout posts on the Syrian-Turkish border, as if to say that they're there to stay permanently. And then suddenly a week later, the US is pulling out. Now what changed? Well, the fact of the matter is that it's very likely that Turkey was triggered by the idea that the US was going to stay there indefinitely. And it was triggered by these statements and the lookout posts. Because what it means for Turkey is that they have to contend with the YPG staying in Syria for a long period of time, which is going to strengthen the PKK. The YPG has the same anarcho-communist, ethnocentric ideology as the PKK, which in the US and Turkey is designated as a terrorist organization. So for the longest time, the US has tried to differentiate the YPG from the PKK, but all it is the YPG is the PKK's Syria faction. And it became very abundantly clear that they were the same group when the YPG held up the flag of Öcalan when they took over Raqqa, Öcalan being the leader of PKK and a designated terrorist by the US. Essentially, the US were supporting a terrorist group by their own definition. These Kurdish groups that they're supporting. And it just so happens that they didn't want to choose them over a NATO ally such as Turkey, which is far more powerful. Now, when I say they, I'm talking about Trump's faction and those that support Trump. They know that if the US troops were to stay and Turkey invades, things are going to get far, far worse. I mean, the US position right now is already untenable. But if they were to stay, it would definitely get worse. I mean, 2 days ago, Erdogan called Trump and told him Turkey is about to invade North Syria and fight the YPG. And if US soldiers are in the way, then they're going to get hurt. They're going to get caught in the crossfire. At the same time as this happening, like around the same week on the 11th of December, the Russians installed S-300s in Deir ez-Zor, which means that the US's air supremacy in the area was threatened. And the Syrian army, at the same time as that, was massing on Al-Tanf border crossing, which is in the south of Syria. So you had a threat from the north, a threat from the east, and a threat from the south. Basically, there was no way that the US troops being there would be safe. And then if Trump had not pulled them out, or is not agreeing to pull them out, what would happen? They would get caught in the crossfire between Turkey and the Kurdish groups, and the body bags will start to come home, and then he will lose his presidency. The writing is on the wall. I mean, not only that, he'd be fighting NATO. Turkey is part of NATO. I mean, the US would be fighting NATO. So what are the neocons thinking? Even at the beginning, what were they thinking getting into Syria? Secondly, what are they thinking that they can stay at the risk of 2,000 American soldiers' lives? They wouldn't put their own children there. So that kind of goes to show you the hypocrisy that they live by when you hear them talking about it. And, you know, if you look at the neoliberals, it's the same thing. I mean, supposedly these people were anti-war and, you know, pro-human rights. Suddenly they want US troops to stay in Syria and fight a war. Where are they fighting the war? Why? Because they want to carve out Syria and decide who gets what land? If they're so worried about Kurds not having a state, why don't they give them their own country? Why don't they give them a piece of their own country? You would never hear them say that. And of course, if you know anything about the history of the Kurds, you know that they don't have their own state because they never built one. They were a nomadic group, just like Bedouins and Gypsies. They're an Iranian-speaking group that originate from Iran, so they do have an original homeland. It just so happened that they walked into Armenia, Turkey, Iraq, and Syria and Assyrian territories, but they have no historic building to lay claim to having any history there. And now some people might say that that doesn't matter, but the fact is that the people who were originally there, that built these civilizations, are still there. And they have as much right to be there as anyone, and they shouldn't have to live under a Kurdish dominion or Kurdish ethno-state. Because as the Assyrians, Christians in Syria and Iraq are complaining about, is that they're being ethnically cleansed by the Kurdish groups that the US supports. This is the so-called humanity of the neoliberals. I really hope that we do see this US withdrawal. I will be cautious about it because the last time this happened, of course, when Trump announced that the US is no longer going to pursue regime change in Syria in 2017, there was a chemical attack. And suddenly his whole position was flipped around and he was attacking Syria. So maybe we will see a false flag. It will be very obvious if we do. But I have doubts, but we should be cautious. And I hope that you will continue to support us and observe what's going to happen. If the US does, pull out, it may still be funding groups from a distance. We don't know for sure if it even will. So I thank you for your continued support. And this is a great news for both the American people and the Syrian people, just in time for Christmas. And I really value that support, and I hope it keeps going. So, Merry Christmas.